but my name is Bill Goldie. I'm the funding consultant for the Iowa League of Cities. I know a lot of you, and for everybody I haven't met, thank you for joining us today. What this webinar is about is just to kind of give an overview of the bipartisan infrastructure law, really how it relates to Iowa. And I'm going to spend a lot of time focused on how to apply for funding, the different types of grants that might be available, and things of that nature. I do think this is going to take up an awful lot of time to go over. So I don't really think I'm going to have much in the way of being able to answer questions through it. If we do have some time at the end and you have questions, I'm more than happy to help you out then. If not, you'll have my contact information. If you want to talk about something specific with your city, I'm more than happy to walk you through any opportunity that you might be wanting to approach. So again, thanks, and we'll get going here. So what is the bipartisan infrastructure law? Everybody heard about this. It was passed by Congress last November, and it authorized $1.2 trillion in additional spending. The money went towards older programs that have been in existence before. It's also created some new programs. 550 of that, 550 billion of that 1.2 trillion is going to new investments. And what they mean by new investments, it could be an existing program that they're going to fund a little bit more. And they did create a bunch of new programs too that you can apply through funding. A lot of the funding is going to be competitive grants that you can apply for directly through the federal government and grants.gov, and we'll get into that a little bit more, and that's what's called this discretionary spending. But a majority of the funding, when we start talking about Iowa, that's the pass-through funding that's coming from the federal government down to the state level. And we'll hit on that pretty hard as we get into this. So almost every federal agency has received a portion of that $1.2 trillion. And the ones that are really applicable to cities the most are USDA rural development and their programs. A lot of it, they did create some additional rural development programs for folks that have used their programs before, but they also beefed up a lot of the existing programs that they had. Commerce is going to be more on the economic and development side of things for those opportunities. Department of Energy, electrical grid and power infrastructure, they did pump billions of dollars in there to improve power. Homeland Security, FEMA grants, those types of things. A lot of the cybersecurity funding is going to come out of those programs. And they did, again, with some of the existing programs like assistance to firefighters, programs like that, they did increase in spending there. Transportation, you're going to see this is the very heavy one. That's where a majority of these funds are going from. EPA, you've got your water infrastructure, specifically a new program about lead lines, service line replacement. And that's most of the EPA program money is going to be a pass through to the SRF program. And so those are the main ones, but there are going to be opportunities from other agencies that cities can apply for funding on. So before we really get into where the money is allocated, I wanted to just kind of do a quick little rundown of the different types of grants. The first one I'm going to hit on is a competitive grant. So when you apply for a competitive grant, you're pretty much in competition with everybody else that is going after that funding. And that's called discretionary funding. So it's a competitive process. You're going to have to put together typically a project budget, a proposal to go after that competitively. When the grant application is received, you have a team of reviewers that go through it to see if it's a good fit for their funding. And it's not a predetermined process like some other grants that are out there. You have to win it based on your merits. And there typically are a lot of rules, a lot of hoops that you have to jump through. Sometimes you need letters of support for your project. Sometimes you need to have strategic partners. All that's going to be laid out in the notice of funding opportunity. And I mean, the one thing I really want to hit on anytime that you go after a competitive grant is to really understand what what you need to have in that application. If you don't have a good understanding and you're not putting your best foot forward, your chances of getting a competitive grant are going to be pretty slim. I mean, you got to follow every letter to the detail when you're going after a competitive grant. So the discretionary funding that's not coming through Iowa that we'll get into, you can apply for grants directly from the federal government, and those are mostly going to be competitive. Another type of grant is a formula grant. So the awardees are predetermined and funding is mathematically allocated to the recipients. A lot of times this is going to be revolving around disadvantaged communities, things, where you have low to moderate income in a community, and they're going to put money aside for that. The other, as it relates to bill, the formula grants are awarded to the states, and the state agency chooses how they're going to divvy out some of that funding. In some instances, the state is going to have to follow the federal requirements, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go along as well. Continuation grants, those are a grant that you apply for with the understanding that money could be there for consecutive years when you apply. A lot of times it's with like an existing community program that might be of interest. Once you apply for the grant, you get the funding. If you are putting your best foot forward and you're doing what you said you were going to do in your grant application, chances are they're going to give you money over the course of 2, 3, 4 years, however long the continuation is going to be for. The one thing to keep in mind with continuation grants, if you don't perform well, you really more than likely are going to lose your funding source moving forward. And the last type, and this is what we're really going to be focused on when it comes to a lot of the money that Iowa is going to receive from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, are pass-through grants. So a pass-through grant, it's coming from the federal agency that I kind of identified where the funds are coming from, and it's passed through to a state agency. So if the money has been allocated to the U.S. Department of Transportation, they're going to allot funds to the Iowa Department of Transportation and so on. And the states will distribute those funds competitively or non-competitively based on the terms of the authorizing legislation. So I put in here, think CDBG grants for you folks out there that have applied for one in the past. That's set up at the federal government. It filters from the federal government down to the SRF program or USDA rural development, another program like that. And the requirements of receiving grant funds from those types of programs are going to have to meet low to moderate income levels to be eligible for grant funding. So if it's set that way at the federal level, when the states accept that pass-through, they got to follow the same guidelines that the federal government set when they awarded the funds. And like I said, pass-through grants as it relates to the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, applicants apply directly through the state on those. So as I was kind of alluding to a couple minutes ago, what we're seeing here in this chart is the percentage of overall funding by agency. And we're talking strictly about from the federal level. We're not into Iowa yet, but what you're going to see is 77% is coming out of, going towards transportation related projects. And all the other categories are really 4 to 8%. We've got commerce, energy, EPA highlighted on here. So remember, commerce is going to be your community economic development programs. Energy is going to be about power and grid. EPA essentially is going to be the monies that are going to be passed through to the Iowa State Revolving Fund. So transportation, it looks a little askew, but what you got to remember about transportation, there's just so many different types. It's not just streets and bridges. We're talking airports, we're talking transit. A lot of discussions been revolving around doling out some money for states as it relates to electrical vehicle charging stations. So transportation is pretty much a catch-all category. So that's why that looks a little askew. So we talked about, we got $1.2 trillion that Congress approved for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Out of that, $550,000 is going into new investments or new programs. And new investments would mean more or less we're going to fund a existing program a little bit more to get the need out there, and the new programs are part of that as well. So for the new investments in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the power and grid for reliability and resiliency is $66 billion is what they appropriated to that. Broadband, $65 billion to make it more accessible. We're already starting to see that trickle to the state level. I actually put something on the website today about to get eligible for potential broadband funding down the road, but they made a sizable investment to try to get more connectivity around the country. $55 billion of new spending in water. And that's, like I said earlier, that's mostly the new spending is mostly for lead pipes and service line replacement. And $47 billion in cybersecurity, waste management, flood and fire mitigation. That's a pretty decent amount. Cybersecurity, I think we're going to see a lot more programs introduced over the next year or two. But flood and fire mitigation, because of some of the environmental factors, that is sizable. And you'll see on a slide coming up here that some money has already been appropriated to flood protection for the state of Iowa. So new investments in transportation, because of that $550 billion, $280 billion are for transportation programs alone. Bridge repair and replacement, they actually created a new fund, and Iowa is in the process of creating a new fund for that as well. There's a significant amount of money that's going for bridge repair and replacement. Airports, passenger, freight and rail, public transit, ports and waterways, electrical vehicle charging, highway safety. Of everything that I have listed there, again, a lot of new programs, but existing programs that have been beefed up a bit. So new investment funding by category kind of looks like the last chart that we did. Transportation's pretty heavy. We're over $270 billion, and then power and energy, broadband, water, and resiliency, all a little bit over $50 billion, or just a shade under $50 billion. So it pretty much, the new investment is reflecting what the overall $1.2 trillion of the bipartisan infrastructure law is. So there are several opportunities that are announced each month. And I just wanted to highlight a few that are coming up in the next several months. And a lot of this is newer programs that they've established. So we've got a climate pollution reduction planning grants, and that's through the EPA. I haven't seen that trickle its way to the SRF program in Iowa yet. I'm starting to believe that that is going to be a discretionary grant that you apply directly from the federal government for. Energy improvements in rural and remote areas from the Department of Energy. I think we're going to start seeing an awful lot more funding become available for energy. And I've actually had quite a few communities reach out to me to see if there's any funding that's available. The Safe Streets and Roads for All, there's been a lot of communication from the federal DOT about that. That's coming up pretty soon. And, some of the existing programs that the DOT has, reconnecting communities, they did put a sizable amount of funding into that one. The one that we get a lot of questions on, and I know that communities struggle with, is the railroad crossing. Sometimes, they have railroad programs, but this elimination one to eliminate a crossing in your community. We do get prodded on that one from time to time. That's going to be of interest. The Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, which is extremely applicable to Iowa, coming out in the fall. We'll start seeing a lot more information on cybersecurity grants, and that's starting to trickle out. That culvert replacement one, that's pretty much an annual DOT program. And what I'm putting for the estimated opening dates, grants typically are going to open up at the same period for a period of time each year. So when you're seeing it, winter, fall, spring, that just understand that, there's going to be opportunities to more than likely to apply for these programs on an annual basis, at least over the next 5 years. So how's this going to benefit Iowa? And again, I wanted to focus most of the attention on, give you an overview of what the bipartisan infrastructure law is, but really where you guys are going to be concerned is how does that affect Iowa and your ability to apply for funding. So in addition to what we were talking about with the discretionary grants that you can apply for directly through the federal government, Iowa is going to receive at least $5 billion in pass-through funding over the next 5 years. So yes, the state's going to get these funds. The state programs are going to say how you apply for it. And, a lot of that's going to be a discretionary competitive grant that you're going to apply for through a state agency, but $5 billion of that overall 1.2 trillion specifically goes to Iowa. So again, just like overall for the other programs through the bipartisan infrastructure law, a lot of it's going to be heavy on transportation, water, electrical infrastructure, broadband. Actually, looking at some of the numbers that I've seen, Iowa's going to end up with more broadband funding than a lot of the states because the infrastructure isn't, I guess, as built out as especially the areas on the coast. Arts, housing, health, and safety. We're already starting to see some of those funding opportunities for those programs becoming available. And then, of course, there's going to be other ones that pop up. So just like we showed in the other chart, it's very heavy on transportation, what Iowa's going to get. So essentially for the $5 billion that's being projected for Iowa, it's going to be for transportation related programs. And then you've got, I grouped together water, electrical, and broadband. You're still sitting over $500 million for Iowa and that, and then really any other program. So to date, of the $5 billion that's being anticipated, they've already allotted $2 billion to the state of Iowa. What I've got listed here is what's already been announced, but it really hasn't made its way open for, there's not $360 billion right now available for Iowa ports and waterways to go apply for funding. So the process that it goes through, Congress takes a look at it and says, okay, we're going to appropriate this much money. Then it's got to go through a public comment period. Then it gets allotted to the state. And then once it gets down to a state agency, there's public comment period again, or shoring up the program before they do any type of grant announcements and making those funds available. So this is just what's been designated for Iowa to date. So it's not there's $2 billion of funding that's out there that you can apply for right now. But as you can see, I mean, it's things that are well needed around the state. We're talking about roads and bridges, water, and we're going to get into a little bit of what the SRF has received. Flood mitigation, everybody's been struggling with it. It's been really brutal over the last 10 years or so. I could see, and we get a lot of questions about energy and power at the Iowa League. So pollution cleanup, those are existing programs that they just put more money into. And right now they've appropriated $5 million for broadband so far to date. So a few of the Iowa programs that, and a lot of you might be already familiar with them, and I've spoken with a few of the COGs around the state, and the federal aid surface transportation grant program that you would apply for the funding through your regional planning organization. So essentially your COG, and it's funding for roads that are mostly federal aid roads, bridges for any public street, transit capital improvements. from speaking with some of the COG representatives around the state, it sounds like it's enhanced the program by about 25% over what their funding stream used to be. So there does seem to be some considerable amount of funding out there. So to learn a little bit more about the program, you might want to reach out to your COG, learn how do you get onto their funding list and be put into their, I think it's a 5-year plan that they do, and you might want to engage right away. If you have questions before reaching out to them, you can give me a shout and we can talk through what's going on in your city to see if that would be a good program for you. The RISE program, that's been very successful around the state of Iowa. It's a value-added activities to provide maximum economic impact. So a lot of times with new development around highways, there's been a lot of success using that program. So it's generally limited to the development of industrial manufacturing and similar uses that you would have in your community if you have a project going on. And it's more or less, it's very heavy on the developer side of things, but the city really partners with the developer to submit a funding application through the Iowa DOT. So some of the other notable programs, and again, just listed a few of them here. City Bridge Program, that's a new one that the DOT created. It's going to have considerable funds. DOT DNR grant, you've got the Airport Improvement Program. I didn't recognize that there was much in the way of changing the program, much of what they had before, but they did get considerable more funding, or they're expecting considerable more funding. Trails, I mean, if you've got trail projects that are around state aid roads and things of that nature, really good source is the Iowa DOT to go after, or to have a discussion with them. And maybe a trail that you're considering could tap into their program. And then railroad crossing program, that is one that is used quite a bit. And like I said before, there's been considerable money that's been put towards railroad improvements or safety improvements around railroads. So funding through the SRF program, and my gosh, guys, I guess I am rolling through this, so we're going to have time to talk about any questions that you might have. Funding through the Iowa SRF. The SRF has received a considerable amount of funding to date. Just for their drinking water program, they got a $28.5 million more to apply for their revolving fund, and 14 million of that 14 million is in loan forgiveness. We'll get into that in a minute. Clean water, which would be your wastewater projects, your stormwater projects, there's $24 million have already been received by the SRF, and 12 million in loan forgiveness. And coming soon, and I just checked the SRF website before the webinar, they really don't have much information on the lead pipe and service line replacement out there yet, but $45 million has come through the SRF for that program as well. So SRF, as it relates to loan forgiveness, they have a matrix, and most of the funds that they're going to put out there for loan forgiveness is going to be to disadvantaged communities. So low to moderate income, you have a high LMI. They're looking at a lot of other data to determine status too. So first and foremost, the three things that they look at, they're going to look at project priority. Why are you doing the project? A lot of times you might have a notice from the DNR that you're out of compliance or you're coming out of compliance. So your project priority points are going to be a little bit higher for when you're being told that you have to make some sort of improvement. So that's going to be taken into account as it relates to loan forgiveness. So socioeconomic score, that's what we're talking about when it comes to disadvantaged communities. They're going to look at a variety of different data to see what is your low to moderate income, what's your unemployment rate, what is your tax base compared to some other communities, household burden, what is your current utility rates. So if you're doing a $5 million water project and you're not getting loan forgiveness, and you've got disadvantaged status, and you have high project priority points, because of the burden that we're creating on the household, that warrants more in the way of loan forgiveness. And there are some stipulations in the bipartisan infrastructure law of the money that the state revolving fund received that said you need to use some of this for loan forgiveness. That's why they have a lot more than they typically would. So based on those factors above, they're going to take everything into account. They're going to really assign points to this from 0 to 10. And if you're on the 0 to 2 to 3 range, they're going to say, well, you're a more affluent community. You don't have a lot of debt right now against your system. Your utility rates can go up a bit to where it's still affordable for folks. You're not going to be eligible for loan forgiveness. When you have some heavier debt load and there's an inability to pay and you have a high LMI, the SRF is going to take that into consideration. And that's who they're going to say is more worthy of receiving loan forgiveness. So a number of you folks have reached out to me about IIJA programs, the Iowa Economic Development Authority. They're going to receive a lot of those economic development funds as a pass-through through the bipartisan infrastructure law. Destination Iowa, that's being enhanced. A lot more funding's coming that way. For those of you that aren't familiar with that, it's the program's about creating a sense of place and enhancing tourism in your community. Really, really good program. A lot of the community development block grants, even the water sewer fund that a lot of cities go after, that comes through the IIJA. And community development block grants, for those of you that haven't heard the term before, it's that formula. It's a formula grant that becomes a pass-through, and to be eligible for it in most cases, you've got to have disadvantaged status to be able to receive that. But there's a variety of CDBG programs that Iowa Economic Development Authority administers. Empower Rural Iowa, so it's investing in and growing and connecting rural Iowa. I do think a considerable amount of funding is going to go into that program. I did want to point it out too, because, you can apply for grant funding and it's great when you do get it. But a lot of times, especially when you're going after a discretionary grant and it's competitive, there's a chance that you're not going to get funded. Definitely take into consideration that there are some really good loan programs out there. And I put one of them in the presentation because I just wanted to point it out. Low interest loan program through IIJA for nuisance abatement and energy infrastructure improvements. Almost every community out there struggles with nuisance properties. Yes, you can go after the DNR derelict building program to get a building demolished, but a lot of communities don't know about this low interest loan program that the IIJA does for nuisance properties. That might be something that you want to consider. So, and again, these are just a few of their programs, and they have a lot more that anything community and economic development, I would check through IIJA to see what they have. So applying for funding. So first, let's talk about what a grant life cycle is. I mean, anybody that's applied for a grant kind of gets this a little bit, but I just wanted to do a quick 101. So you got 3 phases of a life cycle. So you got the pre-award phase. That's when the funding opportunity is announced and you submit your application. Then you've got your award phase. So discretionary grant, you're applying, it's competitive. You got a team of reviewers that's looking at your application. They're going to say, okay, you're worthy of funding, or you're kind of missing the mark on what we're looking for to award it. But the award phase is when you're notified. And the post-award phase, that's the implementation, getting the project built, reporting on it. Think about what's going on with ARPA compliance reporting. You got to do reports on the grant funding that you're receiving, and then project closeout. So the post-award phase, the implementation, we also call that's your grant administration. you're doing the reporting and you're closing out the grant. So applying for federal grants. So again, you've got $1.2 trillion that has been appropriated through the bipartisan infrastructure law for a variety of different programs that would be useful to your community. And most of that funding, with the $5 billion set aside for Iowa as a pass-through, there's going to be pass-through amounts to other states and everything, but the remaining portion of the funding is going to be applying for federal grants. Now, almost everything that you're going to apply for from a federal level is going to be a competitive grant. It's going to be pretty labor intensive to put together the application. So the first thing that you would need to do if you had an interest in applying for funds would be to make sure that your SAM registration's up to date and current, because you're going to need that to be able to apply for funding. So you would need SAM to be current. You're going to need to know what your unique entity identifier is. It's a number that's associated with SAM. It's found on that website. So once you have that in hand and you think that you're going to go after a federal fund, the next thing I would do after I have my SAM information is get on grants.gov and register for an account. So just, you can register for an account now without applying. I would recommend that any community that's going to go after a federal grant do that. And then on that website too, for grants.gov, you can search for the grant opportunities that are available right now. And you'll be able to read the announcement of funding. You're going to be able to see which entities are eligible to apply for it. And you'll be able to find pretty easily, it'll show you which local governments can apply for. And I'm going to kind of talk about this a little bit now, but through this funding, not just through the monies that are available from the bipartisan infrastructure law, but you're going to start seeing grants if you start taking a look at grants.gov, and you're going to see that, maybe a state agency or a county is eligible, but not a city. So in instances like that, if you notice a grant program that might be applicable to what you're doing in your community and you want to go after funding, a lot of times the local government can be a subrecipient of that. So you would work with the entity that would have to apply for funds, either working with your county, in some instances reaching out to folks at the state saying, hey, I have an interest in this broadband grant. Is the state going to submit an application for this? Are you going to have a funding stream available? If not, is there a way that, can I be a subrecipient of a grant application? Then you can kind of collaborate on that grant. So thoroughly read through the notice of funding opportunity. You definitely want to do that because, again, these are very, very labor intensive. And if you don't have a realistic chance of landing that grant because your project just doesn't meet the criteria that they're looking for, you might just want to pass and not put forward a bunch of hours into it. If it does appear to be the right fit, and it's saying, hey, you need a letter of support, you need other stakeholders need to be part of this application that you're going to have to put in the narrative. That's the point of time, like, okay, start identifying who those stakeholders are and start reaching out to them to say, I'm going to apply for this grant. I want you to be involved in the process. The other thing is enlist the assistance of your consultants to assist with the application. So a lot of these, we're talking about transportation heavy, and when you're applying for those funds, you're going to need to know how much things cost, what the project scope is. You might even need to have a little bit of pre-design done before you start applying for funding. So you're really going to need the assistance of your engineer to kind of help you get that grant application filled out. A lot of other times too, like there's a couple communities I talked to about the Assistance to Firefighter Program grants, and they were applying for grants to replace pumper trucks. They ended up working sometimes with their COGS or another consultant, and you definitely need your volunteers from the fire department, your fire chiefs, and maybe even some of their vendor consultants to kind of help with some of the applications there. So you really need to identify them. The other thing that I would strongly encourage, especially if you're going after a sizable grant, you might be in better shape instead of trying to do it on your own to start working with a grant writer. And, you know, a lot of the engineering firms out there, if you work with certain firms, they have folks on staff. I know Jim's on this call because I saw him from MSA. MSA works with a lot of municipalities throughout the state, and they have a tremendous amount of people that help with grant writing and other resource planning activities. So you might want to check with your consulting engineer to see if they have a grant writer on staff. If not, you could also reach out to your local COG. You know, they are going to be able to assist with a lot of these funding opportunities. They probably have applied for a lot of the programs that you're going to find on grants.gov, and they definitely have worked with the funding opportunities that are available at the SRF, IIJA, and Iowa DOT. So that's a very big deal, is getting those stakeholders all in line and getting the assistance you need from your consultants to put you in a position to put together a competitive application. The one thing I will say, because I've seen some really good applications before, but they didn't follow the requirements to a letter, like word count, character count. If you don't follow the instructions 100%, chances are they're going to eliminate you from the process. They've got, you know, countless grant applications that they're reviewing. And if you're not following directions, they're going to say, well, why are we going to award the funds if you can't follow the directions? Because maybe you're not using it as it's intended to be used. What's happening more and more frequently now too, because more opportunities are becoming available, and this especially happened a lot more since the bipartisan infrastructure law was passed. These programs have, a lot of times they're going to have a webinar that after they announce the funding, they're going to put a webinar so they give you tips of what you should be doing on your application to put you in the best position for funding. And a lot of times in these webinars, sometimes it's just informational, but sometimes they're pretty cut and dry, and they keep themselves open so you can ask questions, you know, to make sure that it's a right fit for you. And if it's allowed, I strongly encourage this. Sometimes you're going to see a funding opportunity that says you're not to reach out to us with questions about the grant. But if the grantor is allowing it, reach out to the contact for that notice of funding opportunity with any questions that you have. Because a lot of times they're going to give you information to strengthen your application. They're going to say, well, you know, we awarded 10 of these grants last year, and this is what really stuck out to us. And these are why the 10 awardees stood out because of X, Y, Z. So if you can get a little bit of inside information before you start going through the process of writing the grant and reaching out to them, and they're allowing that, I strongly, strongly encourage you to do that. So one thing I will point out, and it's not like this with all the $1.2 trillion. It's not like this with all of the $5 billion that have been appropriated to Iowa. There is the Buy America, Build America Act that most of the funding is going to have to follow. And what that is all steel and iron and steel for a project must be made in the United States. All manufacturing products must be produced in the United States. Must be greater than 55% of the total cost of components of the manufactured product. All construction materials must be made in the United States. I think there are some waivers out there in certain instances. Your consultant, like your engineering consultant, would be able to help you out with that. But a lot of this, you're going to have to follow the BABAT requirements. And by doing so, and I think that anybody that's ever applied for like an SRF loan before knows that it could potentially, some of these provisions can potentially increase your project cost. So keep that just keep that in the back of your mind that when you're bidding a project, it might be a little bit higher because of some of the provisions of how the funding is going to be allowed to be used. It's the same thing with like an SRF program and Davis-Bacon wages paying the competitive wage. Sometimes that will increase your project cost. I will say this, I mean, I really didn't hit on rural development much. Rural development, for those of you that haven't used their program before, it's mostly for the rural communities. The priority that rural development uses is, for funding, if it's a community of 5,500 or less, that's going to be a high priority for them. Most programs that they have, if you're a community that's over 20,000 people, you won't be eligible. And I really haven't seen any program through USDA rural development if you're over 50,000 where you're going to be eligible for. But what I will say is, for the smaller communities, they are dumping a lot of money into existing USDA rural development programs. You might want to reach out to your regional rep if you're looking at something, and I could help direct you to, and you'll have my contact information when we're done with this, but you might want to reach out to them when you do have a need, because they are creating new programs, and some of their existing programs might fit the project that you guys are considering applying for grants, or even applying for a loan. So few helpful resources on here. We've talked about it a little bit. So you've got grants.gov. That's going to give you an understanding of all the federal grant opportunities that are available out there. It's, again, your competitive grants where you apply directly to a federal agency. You've got iowagrants.gov, which is going to show all the open state grant opportunities right now. So IIJA programs, if SRF isn't really, they don't really have a grant program. It's more the revolving fund, but they do dole it out. But any state agency is going to be listed there. You've got the local infrastructure hub, and it's news and resources about federal funding. So any type of new announcements that are coming up saying, hey, this is going through a public comment period, or, I've seen some resources through the hub that show, tips on writing grants and things like that. They've got some pretty valuable information out there for sure. You might want to check that out. Of course, you want to take a look at the Iowa League's website. So what we've done is we really enhanced it, and we've updated our website on a weekly basis. Every open federal and state funding opportunity that is available right now, that cities are going to be the primary recipient, not like a sub-recipient. Anything that you can apply for on your own as a city, we've been putting on our website. We put them into two separate sections. We've got one for federal opportunities where you would apply through grants.gov. And then we've got the other state programs where you would apply through a state agency. So we've kind of taken Iowa grants and grants.gov and put it at one spot where you guys can kind of look and read through a quick little narrative to see, okay, this might be something I might want to go after. And at last count, we've got close to, I looked at it this morning, I think we've got close to 40 opportunities listed on the league's webpage as a combination of federal and state grants. And then we've got, contact us for questions. From our website, there is a tab in there. If you've got questions about funding, you got something specific going on in your community and you just want somebody to talk to give some general guidance, I'm the guy that you're going to be talking to, and we'll talk through what's going on. And, I'll help point you in the right direction. Does this grant look like something I should go after from a federal level? Or, this is a project that we're considering. Do you know of any opportunities? What I'll start discussing with you is not, I'll discuss federal and state programs too, but if I know that there might be something more on a local level, a county level, something like that, or a foundation out there, I might be able to direct you in that area to go after a grant too. So even if there is something that may or may not be a match and you just got general funding questions, by all means, reach out to me and we'll talk through what you got going on and see if we can find a match that might work well for you. So with that said, it looks like we've got about 15 minutes left. I threw a lot out there. Again, sorry about the wordiness of it, but I wanted to make sure I put together a presentation that could be utilized a little bit more as a guide than just pretty pictures and everything. So I hope that was helpful. So we can go ahead and open it up to questions. And I've got Jess Vogel helping play traffic cop here. So do you guys have any questions? Feel free to ask. Oh, and just put on here, we're going to email the presentation out to everyone as well. We're also going to have it on the website. So if you want to ask a question, feel free to take yourself off mute and go ahead and ask. Just identify who you are, who you're with.
Hi, I have a question. This is Brant Johnson from the city of Ankeny. I've seen a couple of departments utilizing an alternative to grants now called vouchers. Can you provide any information on those types of, streamlined, I guess, an alternative to grant, and if there are other departments out there that are going to be utilizing that type of form when applying for grants now?
Which, out of curiosity, Brant, which departments were using those?
The one that I've seen is from the Department of Energy, and it's their Energy Efficiency and Conservation Block Grant Program.
Okay. I'll be honest, I'm not familiar with vouchers. I haven't heard much about it, but I could definitely do some research and get back to you. Do me a favor, if you could reach out to me through an email, just remind me, and I promise you, I'll definitely take a look at that and get back to you and see what I can find out for you.
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
You have a question in the chat. How often does the SRF do loan forgiveness? Yearly, quarterly?
Essentially, Ginger, they do it until they run out of funding. So you first have to get on the project priority list. And once you're on the list, and then they take a lot of the other factors into account, they're going to determine if they have funding that is available when you're on that list and when you're making the application, then they'll consider you for it. So they have just a finite amount of money. Right now, the last I saw a couple of weeks ago when I was looking into the program, it looks like they're not considering a loan forgiveness at this time. So the engineer that you're working with on the SRF project, and maybe even your municipal advisor that you're working with, if you're working with two separate entities, you might want to have them, along with you, talk to the SRF to see when should we be making the application for it, when might it be available again. So there really isn't, a quarterly this, that, or the other thing. It's once they run out of funds, they're going to wait till they're appropriated again, is the way I understand it.
With that, in order to do loan forgiveness, does it have to be a new project, or could it be for the old ones that we're paying on but would like to help the residents?
What I'm seeing right now is it's not loan forgiveness on a project that they're already funding. So if you've already applied for it, you've got a loan through the SRF, it's an existing one, chances are you're not going to get loan forgiveness. You got to remember too, when this law was passed, that was in November 2021. And a lot of your existing SRF loans out there were prior to the passage of the new funding that became available. So it would not be eligible.
Bill, this is Jim Holtz.
Hey, Jim.
Hey, I do believe that they were going to make SRF loan forgiveness available for those on the IUP that have not closed on their loans.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't. Thanks for putting it that way, Jim. What I was saying is, if you have a loan in place, they're not going to do it. But yes, if you're on the IUP.
Right.
I said it in an awkward way, and my buddy Jim corrected me. I like that.
I did notice on your slide that you had for that it looked like the way it read on your slide, that loan forgiveness was up to 30%. But there's actually the potential of up to 90% because each one of those criteria gets you a
30%
percent of loan
apiece.
forgiveness. The priority project provides you with a percentage. The socioeconomic factor provides you with a percentage, and the household burden provides you with a percentage.
So that's the three criteria that they're looking at, and it's up to 30% for each category.
Well, it's not 30 for each category, but some of them are 30, some's 20, but a
No,
total
that's what I said, up to
90, but
Right.
they also said that it would cap at 2 million.
Have you heard from the SRF when they're going to be doling out loan forgiveness again? Because like I said, the last I heard, it's not available.
Yeah, we've got a couple of projects that we're working on right now that we've been talking to them about what percentages we could be looking at. They haven't provided any yet, but they're at least talking to the communities about it. So I would suggest that if anybody's looking at trying to get loan forgiveness, that they get on the IUP.
Right. Thanks for putting that into context, Jim.
Yeah, and your lead service line, that's actually the emerging contaminants program, right?
Yes.
Which also includes PFAS as eligible, an eligible expense, dealing with the presence of PFAS in a water system. And they're looking at 100% forgiveness to help with those projects, but they don't have
really
that program.
Yeah, they haven't really announced a lot of the information yet. And that was
Right.
another question that just popped up. When will loans be available for lead line replacement? But it does sound like, Ginger, that's one that you're going to want to look at when they get more information out there. There could be considerable grant funding available for that project.
Bill, hi, this is Jan Leonard at the City of Corning.
Hi.
We currently have a grant through Iowa Economic Development. It's a HUD grant for facade. And the deadline to have 80% of the project done is the end of May. Well, because of engineering, it's hard to get the engineering and then supplies and blah blah blah. We're ordering windows we're taking 6 to 7 months to get. I'm not going to have the project done by the end of May, and so Iowa Economic Development has requested HUD to extend it.
Right.
But so far we don't have any answers. Is there any is there contact or any way that we can find out from HUD if we can get that loan extended or the grant extended?
I could probably try to find you a contact through HUD, but your best bet is what you've been doing, Janice, is go through IIJA and keep working with them, because they're going to have a better chance of getting you a firm answer than you getting it from somebody. I'm not going to suggest it on this call, but if you want to reach out to me directly, I have another strategy for you too. but I need some deniability of what I'm going to suggest. So reach out to me directly, give me a call, and let me talk you through that a little bit more.
Okay, we have contacted both Grassley and Ernst's offices.
Okay. How did that go? Did they get anywhere with it? Because they do.
No, not really. They gave us some names, but it hasn't really. I haven't gotten an extension. And it's my understanding that there are other cities that are also having the same problem with timing, because, supplies have just been backed up. And
Right.
After the hurricane in Florida, everybody's ordering windows. So
you said it's the deadline was in May. Is that what you said?
yeah, Iowa Economic Development put a May 31st deadline on it to give them time to process their paperwork. I don't think it's actually due until sometime in July.
Right.
But they said, it's going to take them a while to get all the paperwork.
Well, trying to procure, contractors and supply chain issues and everything else. I think it's it's a chronic project that you're seeing everywhere. I can't imagine that you're going to be denied on an extension for something like that. But I mean, it sounds like you're doing the right things. You know, you're in touch with IEDA and saying, hey, we're not going to get this done within the time. You've reached out to the senator's offices. That's a really good idea too. I've heard a lot of communities have had success when they have reached out, especially when they've been having difficulty on SAM renewal and things like that. They've been able to get some traction when they've reached out to either Senator Ernst or Grassley's office.
Okay, I will call you.
Okay.
Thank you.
We have another question in chat. Did you say the Clean Water SRF will include wastewater construction projects to facility upgrades / improvements?
They have two different programs. So they've got the drinking water program. So that's if you got a project that's a water project that's, you know, distribution system, updating water treatment, that is one program that the SRF has. The clean water side of things application would be for your wastewater facilities. So those are the two different programs that the SRF has. So what we're talking about with the lead service line replacement, that is going to be a drinking water project. So anything with your wastewater facility, your lagoons, things of that nature, you would make an application through the clean water. I will point out too, and definitely, I mean, talk to your engineer and you could, you know, and I'll give you a little bit of guidance too if you reach out to me. But the SRF program, you've got, even if you don't get like loan forgiveness or not enough grant forgiveness in your opinion, they do have very low interest rates. I think I think it's 1.75 still. Maybe there's still, I think, a quarter of a point servicing fee. So it's a 2% loan. That's still very low. But USDA rural development, some of their programs can get a lot of grant funding. You might end up paying a little bit more in interest. It is a lot more labor intensive and not as cut and dry as the SRF program to get everything in place. But a lot of smaller communities have had success, especially if you have high utility rates in your median income within your community is low. There could be some grant opportunity there. So if you end up running into an instance where you're ready to apply for funds, I can kind of talk you through the programs a little bit more too. All you have to do is reach out. Well, we're right around 2 o'clock now. I hope this was helpful. Again, it was just more of an overview of what has been announced so far, what to expect, and at least give you a little bit of information about, you know, the different types of grants and how do you apply for them. But I would strongly encourage you that if you do have any questions whatsoever, feel free to reach out to me directly, either via our website through the link that we have there. And on the last page of this presentation, you've got my email address and my cell phone number, and feel free to reach out anytime. On that note, thank you for attending. I appreciate it, and have a great day. And Brant, don't forget to email me. I'll get back to you about the vouchers. Take care, everyone.